The La Crosse Public Library Archives presents Dark La Crosse Stories, a series in collaboration with the La Crosse Tribune, featuring the seedier side of La Crosse, Wisconsin's history. These true stories are reflections of their time and place in history. The intent is not to diminish the human suffering that may have resulted from these events, but to bring light to ways in which people in the past experienced life. The city of La Crosse and the locations where these stories took place occupy part of a vast network of the ancestral lands of the Ho-Chunk, and we thank our Ho-Chunk community members and their ancestors for their stewardship of this area's land and history.
Walter Goetzinger, known throughout the Midwest as the famous blind organist, moved away from La Crosse in 1925, looking for a larger market. While Walter had terrific hearing, could play a number of instruments, and also composed original music, his notoriety came from scoring organ music for silent films. Films would arrive in large canisters to a theater, but often without any notes on how to score the film. Competition for the best organists to play at local theaters was intense, and despite Walter's visual impairment, he was considered the best musician for this type of work. After a messy and very public divorce from his wife Louise in La Crosse, Walter married a former teacher at the State School for the Blind in Janesville, Lily Lowry, who was a soprano singer. The couple decided to move to Milwaukee so that Walter could work in a West Side theater. Walter had 3 children from his earlier marriage who lived with them. What should have been a routine day like any other in his new hometown was catastrophically upended. On October 18, 1927, Lily had just sent the 2 younger children to bed when a police officer arrived at the doorstep to tell her that Walter's 16-year-old son, Gordon, had been shot by Fred Schulz while walking along 49th Street and was likely to die. Described as valiant in his efforts to live, Gordon remained conscious almost up to the time of death. Due to his injuries, Gordon Goetzinger died Wednesday afternoon at 1:30 p.m. Walter had been familiar with the Schulz family for 11 years in La Crosse. Fred, the accused assassin, was a streetcar operator who had a couple of accidents on the job, forcing the family to move. His wife, Emma, helped Walter read new sheet music so he could keep up with new musical trends. The Schulz family followed the Goetzingers to Milwaukee. Walter and his family had welcomed Mrs. Emma Schulz and her 3 children, ages 12 and under, into their home following a separation from her husband 2 months prior to the shooting. The shooting took place near the Goetzinger home as Gordon walked Emma to a bus stop nearby. Neither of them knew that Fred Schulz lurked outside, waiting in a jealous rage with a rifle in his hands. First, he gunned down Gordon, who had stepped in front of Emma to shield her, then turned his attention on Emma while she attempted to flee. Shot in the back of the head, she died instantly from the attack. Miraculously, Gordon managed to drag himself to a neighbor's door. Fred intended to take his own life, shooting himself in the eye, which blinded him on one side, but did not prove fatal. The shootings took place outside the Beth-El Jewish temple, causing worshippers to step outside, many witnessing Emma fall to the ground and Fred's attempted suicide. Newspapers in Milwaukee and La Crosse reported this story as Emma's mother, Mrs. Teresa Tracy, still lived in La Crosse and, most shockingly, allied herself with the man who murdered her daughter.
Emma should have taken him back. If they try to send Fred over the road for this, I'll do all I can to help him. I've always liked Fred. Fred has his faults, everybody has, but I've always overlooked them. He had so many good points to outweigh them. If they had only stayed here in La Crosse, this terrible thing would never have happened. I'd have had them together again in 2 days. He loved her so much. I never saw another man have greater love for a woman, but he was so jealous that he wanted no one to visit with her. Why, he even disliked my visiting her. He wanted her just for himself. You know, Emma was a very pretty woman. She made friends easily, but Fred wanted her to talk only to him. Since they separated 2 months ago, Fred has been all alone, with no one to go to. If she would have taken him back, I know he would have been good to her.
Police described the crime as one of careful planning, noting that Fred Schulz made out a will the day prior, wrote a letter to his Aunt Minnie instructing her to look after his children, rented a car, purchased the rifle, and waited near the Goetzinger home to spot his wife. While being questioned at the hospital, Fred told the police superintendent,
"Because I love her, I shot her. I made up my mind that I would end it all."
Emma and Fred had been married for 15 years, living in Milwaukee only for the last year. Emma filed for divorce in August, citing cruel and inhumane treatment. She also filed for custody of their 3 children. While living with the Goetzingers, according to Emma's friends, she was scared to go out alone at night, fearing her husband's retaliation and rage. For this reason, Gordon Goetzinger was escorting her to the bus stop so that she could finalize the details of sending her children to the Lutheran Children's Home of Wauwatosa, pending final settlement of the divorce action.
I intended to kill young Goetzinger as well as my wife when I shot them Tuesday night. It was no accident that I killed the boy.
Schulz's statement of intent surprised detectives, who originally assumed the 16-year-old was shot accidentally when he stepped in front of Emma. According to the police, Schulz's antipathy for the boy grew out of intense jealousy. After conversations with his wife grew more estranged, he believed she was happier away from him than she was with him. Somehow, Schulz connected her change in attitude with her connection to the 16-year-old Gordon. Despite their age difference, Schulz convinced himself that Gordon must be in love with his wife and that she returned the affection.
Fred was a boy of very good habits. He didn't drink, he didn't chase other women, he didn't even look at other women. Like anybody else, they had troubles, and Fred would go away for a day or two until he got over it. Then he'd come back. He'd always come back. And things would be all right again for years. He wanted to come back now, and would have if she had let him. That's where she made her mistake. My Emma was a good woman too. Don't misunderstand me on that. She was pretty, a good housekeeper, a good piano player, and had no bad habits. She was always a good, straight girl. She never did anything wrong or got into any trouble, and she made a good wife for Fred. But she was a bit unappreciative. I know she was ready for death, though, and I'm grateful for that. She was afraid of him and thought he might kill her. She knew he could not live without her, and that one would have to die if they could not go along together. She told a friend in Milwaukee a little while ago that she was prepared for death, and that's some consolation.
Mrs. Tracy received a letter from Schulz sometime after her daughter began divorce proceedings. In it, Schulz's intentions were clear.
Dearest mother-in-law, please forgive me everything. I had a case of nerves and she could not forgive. I guess she did not want to. Please see that the children are kept together if possible. Take a certain amount monthly from the policies for their care. I know you'll love them. Furniture to you if you want it. Fred. P.S. I called up Emma again yesterday on the phone and begged her to give me another chance, but she absolutely refused. All my good deeds are entirely forgotten. I loved her so. She told me she was sorry she had not left me before. After that, I saw red. She should not have said that.
While Schulz remained in the hospital, his brother Arthur arrived from Alaska to collect the three Schulz children: John, age 12, Mary, age 10, and Jean, age 7. Believing his brother had become mentally unbalanced, he brought sacks of fruit and candy for the children, placed them on a train with orders for the brakeman to watch over them as they made their way to La Crosse to stay with family, eventually living with Arthur and his own 5 children. Arthur stayed behind in Milwaukee to collect the body of Emma and bring her home to La Crosse for funeral services. Schulz was expected to recover apart from total blindness, first in the eye he shot and ultimately both eyes, and so 2 warrants were issued, each with a charge of murder.
I was a fool, and I made a fool of myself chasing after my wife. I wanted to be back with my wife for the sake of the children, as I wanted to keep them together and never wanted them to be brought up in any kind of institution. I only meant to scare them when I got out of the car, Emma and the Goetzinger boy. I'm sorry they're dead, but the Goetzinger boy was the cause of it.
When it came time for the trial to begin on November 2nd, 1927, the newspapers reported the dramatic story. Quote, facing a life of darkness into which he was plunged by his own hand after he had killed his wife and a 16-year-old boy who sought to shield her, Fred Schulz, Milwaukee milk driver, formerly of La Crosse, was led falteringly into district court today to face charges of murder. Blinded by the shots he intended to end his life, Schulz faces charges that may send him to state prison for the rest of his life. Unquote. Fred Schulz would plead
Not guilty.
Schulz's attorney, Cornelius Hanley, entered the not guilty plea on the grounds of temporary insanity. As the case progressed, 3 psychiatrists were brought in to determine the state of Fred's mind on October 18th. A group of 5 women and 7 men made up the jury. Multiple character witnesses, including the Crosse family and friends, were called to court in Milwaukee to speak on Fred's behalf. 2 previous employers spoke in his defense, as well as his mother-in-law and mother of the victim, Teresa Tracy. All of them stated that Schulz was well-mannered and unassuming. His brother Arthur testified that Schulz had not owned guns prior to this, nor did he know how to shoot. Perhaps the most surprising but significant piece of evidence that the prosecution brought forth was thanks to Milwaukee Police Department's Detective English, who searched for a hidden gun previously owned by Schulz. In an earlier report, this gun was fired by Schulz at his wife, Emma, though he missed. In anger, he threw the weapon itself at her. He missed again, causing the gun to tear through the wall and lodge itself between partitions. It remained there for years in a La Crosse residence on Hagar Street, where the couple lived years prior. The hidden gun, a .32 caliber revolver, and a contradictory piece of evidence to character witness statements, was now a major part of the state's case, citing earlier family quarrels and violence. Walter Goetzinger, the 45-year-old blind organist and father of the slain 16-year-old Gordon, testified against the defendant along with his wife Lily. 14 witnesses to the shooting also testified as to the events of the attack. When it came time for Scholes to take the stand himself, it took nearly 2 hours to explain to the court and jury his emotional response that led him to temporary insanity.
I had often thought about suicide before October 18th, but had never considered the idea of killing my wife or anyone else prior to that day. I loved my wife and children more than anything in the world. When we got married, I was just 18 and Emma 19. We had no quarrels other than common family spats. We were happy until we came to Milwaukee. I suffered 2 serious accidents while operating a streetcar in La Crosse, which forced me to resign and move to Milwaukee. We'd known the Goetzingers in La Crosse, and after we moved, resumed the friendship. But my wife wasn't happy with our home after seeing the Goetzinger home. I worked 9 hours a day on the milk wagon, and I took a job on Saturday and Sunday at a filling station where I worked another 9 hours. I wanted to buy her comforts. Walter Goetzinger would repeatedly say how he believed in divorce, having had a successful one himself. He'd say that in front of us. When we separated, she stopped talking to me for weeks. I wanted to reconcile.
When asked by District Attorney A.J. Beyer if he remembered the occasion when he attempted to choke his wife, Scholes responded,
"No, sir."
When asked, was it not the possession of his wife instead of herself that he loved, Scholes responded,
"I loved my wife herself and not the possession of her."
When asked if his wife was afraid of him, Scholes responded,
"She said she was, but I don't know why."
When asked about the earlier altercation back in La Crosse, Scholes denied ever seeing or owning the .32 caliber revolver or being aware of his wife's story regarding the earlier alleged quarrel. Even when it came to the rifle he used on October 18th, he declared,
"I don't remember buying the rifle."
Case proceedings continued to waver back and forth. Was Fred Scholes sane or not? Everyone in the courtroom was shocked the following morning when Emma's mother, Mrs. Teresa Tracy, left her seat and walked up to the front where Scholes and his lawyer were sitting.
Fred, I know you've always been a good boy, a good husband, a good father. We all love you, Fred.
The pair embraced, making a spectacle between bandages that covered Scholes' eyes and the tears rolling down the face of his mother-in-law. Later that week, Mrs. Tracy made her way to the witness stand.
I will tell the truth, although it hurts my own daughter's memory. This tragedy was her own fault. Fred Scholes was the best husband a girl ever had. He was a good father. He loved my daughter and their children. Both here and in La Crosse, he did all that he could for them. He worked day and night. Something must have happened that made Emma change so.
As the trial carried on into December, no clear solution proved imminent. One medical expert called to testify diagnosed Scholes as sane, but the defense physicians gave cause for doubt. Scholes broke down in his seat while listening to the prosecution recite a detailed description of the shooting, how he had trailed his wife, stepped out of the automobile, and fired the fatal shot to her head. Scholes pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and pressed it below the bandages over his sightless eyes. Before closing arguments were made, 2 more expert physicians were brought in to determine their opinions of Scholes' sanity, or lack thereof. The defense claimed Scholes was a victim of circumstance, while the prosecution called him a, quote, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Finally, at 11:50 a.m. on December 2nd, the jury was retired to discuss 3 possible verdicts: guilty, not guilty by reason of temporary insanity, or not guilty. After 28 hours of deliberation and asking to view all the evidence again, the jury for the Scholes murder case was no closer to a verdict. Being a Saturday morning, the judge declared he would wait for a verdict the following Monday, and all court instructions to the jury were read through a second time. The difficulty in the case was the issue of temporary insanity. When the jury retired once more to deliberate further, members were so split that shouting voices could be heard from the jury room through a corridor and out into the courtroom. Finally, they reached a verdict. Fred Scholes was guilty of first-degree murder. In the hours and days following the guilty verdict, the defense requested a new trial, and 11 of the 12 jurors received threatening notes and telephone calls. Many in the public felt that the self-inflicted wounds Scholes faced were punishment enough, and that leaving 3 young children without a parent was too much. To show they cared, the jury assembled a Christmas box for the Scholes children. Scholes was sentenced to life in prison. When the judge asked Fred if he had anything he wished to say, Scholes answered,
"I want to thank you for the consideration you have given me throughout the trial. I want you to know that I do not remember anything that happened on the night of the shooting. My mind was blank. I realize the seriousness of the crime, and I wish I could undo it."
Fred Scholes was taken to a pond to spend his remaining days behind bars in blindness. When asked what he thought about his sentence, he replied,
"Well, it was as good as could be expected. If I had been acquitted, I wouldn't have known what to do. I hope for the best."
Schulz may have hoped for the best in the beginning, but the loss of his wife by his own hand, the separation from his children, the denial of a new trial, and the blindness that now overtook his days weighed heavily on Schulz's mental health. 15 months after Schulz entered prison, he took his own life by hanging. His body was found in his cell on a Saturday in March of 1929. Ironically, he is buried next to his slain wife in Oak Grove Cemetery. Time didn't stop for the families of the victims from that fateful shooting. The Schulz children lived briefly with their Uncle Arthur in Onalaska until his death in 1928, and were later cared for in La Crosse by his Aunt Minnie, who Schulz had written to regarding his will and their trusts. Lily Goetzinger, Gordon's stepmother, died from illness in 1934. By 1935, Walter Goetzinger, once the famous blind musician with an organ inside the reveille designed to his specifications, had retired. The introduction of sound films slowly erased the need for his work, although Walter transitioned to radio and other live music venues. Goetzinger moved to Janesville and lived with one of his sons for a short duration. In November of that year, he passed away at the age of 50 at the Badger Home for the Blind, succumbing to illness he'd battled for most of the year. His career spanned 32 years, 19 of which were spent in La Crosse's downtown theaters. We can only imagine the dynamic score Walter Goetzinger would have composed for his own final act. And now I'd like to welcome in Anita Taylor-Doring, Senior Archivist and Archives Department Manager at the La Crosse Public Library, who did some of the initial research for this story.
The Walter Goetzinger tale is a prime example of an engaging Dark La Crosse story. The Dark La Crosse suite of programming has grown and morphed into the stories format that we're sharing today. The experience began in 2013 as a downtown walking tour highlighting seedier-themed events that occurred within a 1-mile trek. Step-out actors would walk amongst the audience to reenact some highlights of events to make the experience a little more dramatic. These were very successful and offered in the evening, and there were often waiting lists. We hosted almost 40 tours over the course of 18 months. While they were free, the library did accept donations. While walking around in the dark with strangers can be fun, even I noticed I was often distracted, especially between stops. When we talked to people about making a reservation for the tour, I often fielded questions related to the length and pace of the walk. The following year, Explore La Crosse reached out to the archives about hosting the downtown walking tour on the trolley to make the experience more accessible. We added some more content, and now we've been doing trolley tours during the summer for 10 years. And then I had an idea. I wanted to enhance the content with visuals and music appropriate to the time of the story being shared. We were successful in obtaining a Wisconsin Humanities grant to expand Dark La Crosse program into a theatrical performance. We took the trolley tour, which was an expanded walking tour, and enhanced that even further into a stage show. Additional content was created, actors were enlisted to portray participants or witnesses to the stories, and we hired a brilliant composer-musician, Luke Thering, who arranged and performed music for the shows, similar to Walter Goetzinger, whose musical performances enhanced and accompanied the action of silent films. We also created a slideshow with historical images and newspaper headlines to play in the background. This format allowed for an expanding geographical area, which was no longer restricted to the downtown area like the walking and trolley tours, and people's attention would be focused solely on the stories and what was happening on stage. Each performance was followed by a Q&A with the scriptwriters and some members of the research team. We originally scheduled 3 free shows in January 2015, but ended up doing 5 because the shows were overbooked. Given the community excitement, we decided to bring it back in the fall to use the show as a fundraiser for the library. We were able to secure corporate sponsors that underwrote the cost for each performance, and we sold out every show. While the stage show was a success for us, it was labor-intensive and time-consuming. So we began looking for a way to share the content beyond the walls of the theater. Dark La Crosse Stories began in 2019 as a collaboration with the La Crosse Tribune. After 5 years of the stage show, we had 50 stories that we turned into 50 episodes of a video series podcast found on YouTube and major podcast platforms. Complete with original music, historical photographs, and newspaper headlines that were featured in the stage production, each episode of Dark La Crosse Stories also features bonus material from the research team. The Q&A portion of the stage show morphed into what we call a talkback played after the conclusion of the story, like I'm doing right now. With the success of Dark La Crosse Stories, in 2020, the local Fox TV station approached us about an idea they had for an original production called Rivertown. They were interested in turning Dark La Crosse content into a dramatized documentary series. The episode, Ballad of Brinkman Ridge, won a Midwest Regional Emmy Award in the historical documentary category in 2023. Some of our stories are wonderfully educational about particular local history topics like prohibition, sex work, the history of the police and fire departments, or indigenous history. While we're always trying to find the dark nugget, often the historical context is just as fascinating. People are obsessed with true crime, and they're even more interested when they can connect to the story in some way. Content we've created for the walking tours, trolley tours, the stage production, the Dark Lacrosse Stories video series, and now the Rivertown TV show have been adapted and reused in countless ways. My team jokes that I'm constantly telling them to repurpose their research in ways for which it was not originally intended. And as I wrap up my 36 years in serving the lacrosse community as its archivist and begin a new life in retirement, the Dark Lacrosse suite of programs has been not only a lot of fun, but I feel will endure for a long time. Through this journey, I certainly learned a lot about lacrosse's past, and I hope you have too. The whole archives team has put a lot of work into this programming, particularly on the research and editing end. But Scott Brower deserves the bulk of your accolades as project manager for the entire series, from a walking tour to the theater stage to the recording studio. It was he who kept pushing me out of my comfort zone to be bolder and more public. And remember, the biggest lesson I have learned from researching all these great stories: if you find yourself on the wrong side of the law, always demand a jury trial. Thanks for listening.